destroy yourself.
At the presidential palace in Saigon, President Thieu closed his office door and refused to see anyone. He had staked South Vietnam's survival on Nixon's personal pledge that North Vietnamese aggression would be met by renewed American air power. Just a few days after the new president, Gerald Ford, moved into the White House, Congress cut in half the funds for military and economic assistance Nixon had promised to deliver to Saigon. Conditions in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate. With the American military presence gone, 1 out of every 5 civilian workers was jobless. Prices soared.
There were many mistakes made by the Americans, but the biggest mistake was in creating the sense of dependency. Another mistake was in creating an army in their own image, an army that was used to fighting a rich man's war, and South Vietnam was too poor to be able to sustain that kind of war.
Thieu had steadily grown more authoritarian, closing newspapers, restricting opposition parties, selling political and military appointments. A coalition of Catholics and Buddhists charged him with corrupting every aspect of South Vietnamese life and demanded his resignation. Thousands of demonstrators poured into the streets of Saigon. Meanwhile, the chronically underpaid South Vietnamese army had its pay cut further. It began to disintegrate. As many as 20,000 men were deserting each month, most heading home to try to help their families survive in such hard times. Those ARVN who stood and fought often had to do so without the sophisticated weaponry they'd been trained by the Americans to use. Much of the equipment Nixon had provided was ill-suited to the war the South was now waging. Aircraft, for which there were no trained pilots or ground crews. Artillery and military vehicles, for which there were no spare parts. And the U.S. Congress was in no mood to provide more. Fuel ran low, so did ammunition. Before long, artillerymen in the Central Highlands could fire just 4 shells a day, and infantrymen were limited to 85 bullets a minute. In November of 1974, the Politburo and the Central Military Committee met in Hanoi to discuss strategy. Some members urged caution. They worried that if they tried to push Saigon to the point of collapse too quickly, the Americans would return. The final victory, they calculated, would come in 1976. Party First Secretary Leys One didn't agree. Now that the United States has pulled out, he said, it will be hard for them to jump back in. He ordered a test attack to see if the Americans would intervene with air power as they had during the Easter Offensive 2.5 years earlier. In December 1974, North Vietnamese forces attacked Phuc Long, northeast of Saigon. Within 3 weeks, they had overrun the entire province and had killed or captured thousands of ARVN defenders. The United States did nothing in response. President Ford, preoccupied with other problems, inflation, unemployment, tensions in the Middle East, held a press conference that offered the South Vietnamese no comfort.
Are you considering any additional measures beyond the supplemental of assistance to the South Vietnamese government?
I am not anticipating any further action
beyond that supplemental at this time.
Washington seemed to have no interest in fulfilling the secret pledges Nixon had repeatedly made to Thieu. He was stunned.
With the communist flag planted in a provincial capital just to the north of Saigon, to me the handwriting was on the wall. I then communicated with my family and told them that even though my tour was supposed to take me till August, that I would be home sooner, and then I began to quietly, one little box at a time, mail my possessions out of Vietnam.
The North Vietnamese now undertook a new assault on cities in the Central Highlands, including Ban Mi Thuot, where their forces outnumbered the overextended ARVN nearly 6-1. Ban Mi Thuot fell in 2 days.
Here is the second province to fall, and it falls very quickly. At that point, they realized, well, we don't have to wait till 1976. We can go for it now.
Hanoi was delighted by the Americans' lack of response. But all the previous offensives Blaze I had set in motion in 1964, in 1968, in 1972, had ended in failure. This time, he turned to General Val Win Zac, the architect of the great victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu, who had been silent during the Tet Offensive.
Tất cả những gì diễn ra ở tổng hành dinh sau đó đều diễn ra là một
For weeks, the ARVN top command had warned Thieu that his already weakened forces were spread too thin, that it was no longer possible to defend the entire country. He had angrily resisted, but now, suddenly, he changed his mind. Thieu ordered his troops to abandon Highland, to withdraw under fire, and then regroup in order to retake Ban Mi Thuot. It would have been a near impossible task with a carefully worked out plan. Thieu had none. The result would be disaster.
Rất là bối rối trong những cái chuyện đó, do đó mà ra những cái lệnh không có hợp thời gây cho cái sự hỗn loạn đến nỗi mà bị tan hết rồi.
Within a week, Pleiku and Kon Tum were in enemy hands.
Sau 30 năm chiến tranh liên miên và rằng ra không đến đâu mà mù mịt, tự nhiên có 60 ngày mà chúng tôi biết là quân Sài Gòn sẽ thua. Tức là một người lính thường như tôi biết.
According to Western diplomats here in Saigon, the South Vietnamese are quitting the Central Highlands because they hope to avoid a complete rout. The withdrawal is said to be an attempt to save men and equipment that may become sorely needed in other more heavily populated parts of the country.
Điều đó là bỏ dân, bỏ lính đường quân. Đi rút lên Á thì thấy hết mà dân mà nghe tới cộng sản đó là kêu hoảng là Á thì nó chạy mà. Bao nhiêu người binh sĩ là gia đình người ta ở trên đó mà. Có vợ có con người ta đâu có phải lo cho gia đình.
As the ARVN fled south, 400,000 civilians fled with them. The enemy blocked the main road so that they had to take a disused back road. Thousands died, killed by North Vietnamese shells and machine gun fire, trampled by fellow refugees, run over by retreating tanks, blown apart by South Vietnamese bombs dropped by pilots who mistook them for the enemy. Reporters called it the convoy of tears. Then Wayfair.
Theo đường 11 học thật rồi. Chạy vào huyện từ Ban Đà Nẵng. Đi trên đường đi nhận được việc ban ra rồi sẽ tìm nào.
On March 29, 1975, the North Vietnamese entered Da Nang, South Vietnam's second largest city. Civilians and soldiers alike tried to flee. Da Nang was not captured, an American reporter remembered. It disintegrated in its own terror.
I expected more.
On the same beach where the U.S. Marines had landed nearly 10 years earlier, beginning America's combat involvement in Vietnam, 16,000 ARVN soldiers fought for space with 75,000 terrified civilians. The improvised fleet of freighters and fishing boats headed south to Cam Ranh Bay, Long Mai, and Saigon. Anywhere they thought northern troops might not follow. Thousands drowned struggling to reach the boats. Thousands more were killed by enemy shells raining down on the beach.
Vì nguy nó bỏ nó chạy nó thạo mà. Trước đấy có thể là đánh cả năm trong một cái bản đồ này, nhưng mà cái năm 75 ấy là bản đồ hôm nay có quyền người khác để đi vào. Một tháng 20 mà một ngày bằng 20 năm.
Da Nang, Tam Kỳ, Quang Ngai, Quy Nhon, Nha Trang, Cam Ranh Bay. The North Vietnamese kept moving closer and closer to Saigon.
It was stunning to sit there in Saigon, riding the daily leaves on the fall of all these places. You just were overwhelmed with 10 years worth of history and seeing all of it come unglued.
At the end of March, 18 North Vietnamese divisions, with 5 in reserve, were now arrayed against basically 6 South Vietnamese divisions. It was about 3 or 4 to 1 in favor of the Vietnamese. This was breathtaking.
The North Vietnamese now decided to move against Saigon and take it before Ho Chi Minh's birthday on May 19th. It became clear to Thomas Polgar, the CIA station chief in Saigon, that the time had come to begin preparing for an evacuation. There were still some 5,000 Americans in Saigon, and there were also as many as 200,000 South Vietnamese and their families who had cooperated with the Americans.
Poor performance
But
indeed.
Ambassador Graham Martin disagreed. He was a resolute cold warrior, who had been appointed to reassure Tew of continuing American backing, and his feelings had only been intensified by the death of his son in Vietnam. He had not been appointed ambassador, he had told the aide, to give Vietnam away to the communists. The CIA was being alarmist, he said. There would be no attack on Saigon, and therefore no evacuation. President Tew also continued to insist all was not lost. The ARVN were ready to fight on to the last bullet and the last grain of rice, he said. Just 40 miles east of Saigon, North Vietnamese forces attacked the town of Xuân Loc on Highway 1, the last obstacle on their way to Saigon. Although they were outnumbered and outgunned, the South Vietnamese commander refused to retreat. He was determined to keep the enemy from his capital.
You're certain that you can hold so long?
Surely. I'm certain. I'm sure with you I can hold so long. Even the enemies use it, the double forces, or maybe 3 times more than my forces. But no problem, sir.
Human tragedy has befallen our friends in Vietnam and Cambodia.
You will not. President Ford appealed to a joint session of Congress for emergency aid to Saigon. If they refused and Saigon fell, Congress, not the White House, should take the blame.
Under 5 presidents and 12 Congresses, the United States was engaged in Indochina. Millions of Americans served, thousands died, many more were wounded.
The president asked Congress for $722 million in military aid. There was no applause. Most legislators and their constituents thought it was too late to make any difference. In the end, Congress voted against any military aid.
Because by that time, we didn't ask it for the law.
Playtime is
Ambassador continued to stop.
Evacuation plans were finally drawn. There were 4 options. Sea lift by cargo ships anchored in the port of Saigon. Airlift by commercial airline. A military airlift. And, as a last resort, evacuation by flights of helicopters to a flotilla of U.S. Navy ships in the South China Sea. Ambassador Martin continued to show interest. Abandoned South Vietnam, he said, would produce panic in the streets. On April 21st, Xuân Loc finally fell to the North Vietnamese. The ARVN had valiantly held on for 12 bloody days. Highway 1 was now open all the way to Saigon. That evening, President Tew resigned. 4 days later, the CIA would spirit Tew to Taiwan, where an American emissary brought him a private message from President Ford. It was not a good time for him to visit America. Anti-war feelings were too strong. It is so easy to be an enemy of the United States, Tew said, but so difficult to be a friend. News of Tew's resignation had sent thousands of panicked Vietnamese rushing to Tan Son Nhut Airport, hoping to get out of their country. Some had exit visas, many